Hello, and welcome to What on Earth, the podcast of the Environmental Investigation Agency, or EIA. I'm Paul Newman, EIA's Senior Press and Communications Officer, and today we're going to be taking a look at patterns in the transnational illegal trades in wildlife and timber. Joining me is James Toone, a senior campaigner who works across our wildlife and forest projects, and he's going to be talking about how timber and wildlife crimes actually have quite a lot in common. James, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to share your thoughts with us.
Thanks, Paul. Good to join you today.
Now, your new report, Double Impact, the nexus where wildlife and forest crime overlap, was out earlier this month. To get us started, could you explain just what a nexus is in this context and why it's important?
Sure, yeah. So in this context, we're talking about the relationship and the crossovers between wildlife and forest crime. And when we're talking about wildlife crime, we're talking about both the illegal trade and trafficking of wildlife, but also the illegal appropriation or sourcing of wildlife. And the same issues apply when it comes to forest crime, principally around timber and illegal sourcing and then illegal transportation of timber.
Okay. Now, when you talk about the different streams of wildlife crime, like illegal timber trafficking and wildlife product trafficking, and them crossing over, is that a matter of geographical happenstance, or are the same criminals behind both crimes?
Well, there's a kind of a simple answer to that and then a slightly kind of more complex answer. Simply, yes, sometimes, but it really depends where we're talking about. So if you imagine a scenario where, let's take ivory, sourcing of ivory, for example, it tends to be quite specialist. So poachers and poaching gangs who go out, they go out specifically to find ivory because it's quite an undertaking to go and take out an elephant and take their tusks. And if you imagine the same gang, either diversifying and occasionally going out and trying to look for timber, it's generally going to be a slightly different approach. Timber is much broader in terms of its scale. It requires totally different kinds of equipment. You can't just drag a tree or a number of trees out of a forest. You need specialist equipment to enable you to do so. So actually, you do find that there are differences, but what we found in the report is that occasionally people are using timber, and it may be illegal, it may not be illegal, it may be legally sourced, but they're using timber as a concealment method to move wildlife products, and that was one of the areas of convergence. And clearly, that's an area where if that timber is illegal, then the same criminals are perpetrating both illegal timber and illegal wildlife trafficking.
Yeah, but so by chance there was an example of that actually in the news only yesterday. A major bust in Nigeria of 8.8 tons of wildlife products, mostly pangolin scales and ivory tusks and big cat bones. And they found it in a container that when they first opened it appeared to be stuffed with timber. And when they began to examine it closer, they found the timber was simply a fake wall of timber effectively at the very front of the container, which was then jammed with the IWT. So yeah, I can see how that must be happening.
Yeah, I mean, also on that, Paul, just to draw an important contrast as well. One of the things that EIA investigations have found with regard to illegal timber trafficking is because of the scale, because of the kind of equipment that's used. Often, actually, we're talking about companies. So we're talking about this being done by big entities, and when we're talking about wildlife trafficking, principally, people might be using companies as a front for their trafficking, but that generally tends to be relatively small scale. And you're actually talking about organized criminal syndicates and chains for trafficking wildlife. So that's quite an important area of contrast between the two crime types.
Yeah. In the analysis that you did for this report, have you identified the reasons that these crossovers occur?
Well, the report identifies three principal areas of crossover. So one is geographical, one is the issue that we're just talking about, which is the use of timber as a concealment method, and the third one is the issue of poaching being related to deforestation. And there being a relationship between those two things. If you take the first issue on the geographical convergence, it's very clear that one of the reasons that source countries for illegal wildlife and illegal timber are the same is because the drivers for those two trades or illegal acts are the same: poor governance, the ability to be able to access wildlife and timber because they're both readily available in those contexts, trade links, the ability to be able to form companies, and in this case maybe sometimes as fronts, or the ability to be able to access, in the case of timber, concessions sometimes illegally, by offering bribes, weak and ineffective law enforcement, weak laws. So you can see actually geographically there will be a convergence, and those drivers and those factors are the same. If we take the issue of timber being used as a concealment method, one of the reasons why, and this the bust that you referred to yesterday, I think was similarly the reasons behind it were the same. The timber can be moved legally, and in fact, the scale of timber being moved at the moment, particularly as EIA is looking between Africa and Asia and Asian markets, is huge, and therefore the ability to use timber as a means of concealment, when, if you imagine you were putting, I don't know, pieces of pink chewing gum, that's going to raise some concerns on your bill of lading, but timber being so commonplace won't. And that was a very significant, clear reason why we're seeing movements of timber and use of concealment. And then with regard to the third area of nexus, deforestation as a driver of poaching, well, that is really a causal relationship that we highlighted. And what we weren't able to show in the report, but possibly an area for further research, was, for example, the objective of deforestation being to hunt more wildlife. Actually, principally what we found is that where you're getting areas of logging, and that could be legal concessions or illegal logging, that it's opening up areas of forest which were primarily untouched prior to their being logged, and then the wildlife species within them are much more available to poachers and hunters.
So it's more kind of a matter of opportunism in that respect then, yeah? They see that there's deforestation happening, and then they realise there are ways that they can get in and out of that environment to then go and poach in a landscape that's already been opened up for another kind of crime.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Funnily enough, as an aside, I read only recently, because I'm a bit of a movie nut, in the making of Apocalypse Now, because Coppola and the crew were filming deep in the jungle in the Philippines, they actually had a road quickly built out so they could get to and from the location easily enough. And obviously, after all the drama of actually filming, they packed up and went back to America to get their awards and put the film out. At which point, they found that illegal loggers were using the road to get into this otherwise previously inaccessible area of the rainforest. Wow. And actually extract timber from it. And I would imagine it's probably the next thing is that poachers would get in there because they too then have the access road. So these kind of opportunities are created without any thought about what might actually happen in the aftermath of it.
And that is exactly, Paul. That's exactly the issue that comes up in the report, right? It's the issue of access roads, and as you said it out there in that example, it's kind of intuitive for people to understand that if you don't have a road, it's difficult to get somewhere. But if you build a road, especially in an area of rainforest with the density of trees and everything to try and get around, all of a sudden it's accessible. So yeah, it's
effectively an invitation.
Yeah, exactly.
In your work, have you found any particular hotspots, like where this crossover happens? Are there any places that are particularly prevalent for it?
Yeah, no, that is, I think, one of the most important elements of what we've been able to find within the report, and one of the things that we'd like to take forward in our advocacy on the back of it. Certainly, in terms of sourcing and then transiting, and I alluded to it earlier, but just to be clear, the report does focus on EIA's work, principally looking at Africa to Asia and then the intra-Asia trade. So I'm not talking here about Latin America. We don't do any work in Latin America, so I can't comment on the trends there. But when it comes to hotspots along those two routes, we found significant export of both illegal wildlife and illegal timber coming out of West Africa, in particular Nigeria. So it's unsurprising that your allusion earlier to the bust that's happened, which is really good news, in the fact that it's been revealed and that they've hit somebody on that route. But that is a very, very popular route for the movement of both illegal wildlife and illegal timber out of Africa. We also, further down that West African coast, any of the bigger ports. So we noticed significant issues coming out of Cameroon, and EIA produced a report fairly recently on the sourcing of Cameroonian timber into Vietnam and the illegalities there, and that's through maritime routes out of the ports in Cameroon, and then through from the source areas into the transit areas. What we see, especially with illegal logging, in order to mask the origin, and this can sometimes be the case for illegal wildlife as well, they do something called criminals do something called transshipment. And so what that means is they find a port, usually an intermediate port, so a long route to the eventual destination, and they will unload the container and then reload it, and then they will book a new container moving from that port onto sometimes a further intermediate transshipment point, or the final offloading point before it moves on to the market. And again, we found a significant convergence between the ports that are used. Malaysia, and Malaysia comes up as being probably the most significant, but also Singapore and Hong Kong. And then in terms of final destinations, the demand for illegal wildlife and illegal logging is being driven principally by Asian countries, principally by China, but there's a growing market and a significant market involving Vietnam as well. So we also see an overlap there.
Well, am I right in thinking, I mean, this transshipment, this unloading and reloading of contraband, is that largely done to obscure the origins of it, and to lower possible flags that might be raised in the country of receipt? Because if it's coming from somewhere you wouldn't expect that kind of material to be coming from, then you're not really going to be looking for it, I guess.
Yeah, it is. Interestingly enough, there was a case, an EIA report on the Shuidong connection, when in fact attempts at transshipment, this was in the case of ivory, and ivory being sourced from the East African coast in this instance, and being transshipped in Busan in South Korea and then on to China. In that instance, actually, it was the nature of the route which actually led to the shipping line in question not wanting to take the cargo, because it flagged up slight concerns because it was a bit kind of in terms of pure trade and efficiency and cost, it was going way beyond where they needed to go to Korea to go back to China from Africa. So it doesn't always necessarily work in the smuggler's favour.
Well, I guess not, because we found him in that case.
Yeah, exactly.
Obviously, you've been able to identify several key locations. What would be the value of knowing where these hotspots are to enforcement and others tackling environmental crimes?
That's a really good question, Paul. I mean, I think the most important thing is, look, when I first started working on these issues, I started working on the illegal wildlife trade first, and it was explained to me by somebody at the time that often trying to find illegal wildlife is like searching for a needle in a haystack, but it's like searching for a needle and there are a lot of haystacks, right? So the analogy I'd use is that by being able to identify through EIA's specialist intelligence, our undercover investigations, the kind of work that we do, reliable information that we get on where this stuff is actually happening, that gives a massive reduction in the number of haystacks, right? We're actually finding the haystacks. We've still got to find the needles, and sometimes we can actually find the needles too. And that's why we've been involved in some of the important information which has led to the busts which we've been involved in. But I think the argument we make in the report is to say, look, we've identified these areas. One of the recommendations is to both the international community and to the governments of these countries in question is to prioritize the issues of wildlife crime and timber crime, because we've shown with our evidence that these issues are prevalent, and therefore they deserve attention. And if the international community is serious about stopping the decimation of wildlife species and tackling the decimation of forests, then they're going to need to do that.
Yeah, I guess to riff on your haystacks analogy, we were able to go to enforcement and say, look, we've got rid of 97 haystacks that we know don't have needles in them or are very likely to, but here's 3 that definitely do. And it allows them to zero all their attention in on those, yeah.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, there's times in our work generally when the sheer scale of environmental crime around the world can just feel a bit overwhelming. Have you actually got any good news in the report?
I think what we've been able to show in the report is that there are. I mean, one of the big pieces of good news is that the international community and the extent of focus on the issues of IWT and illegal timber trafficking, illegal wildlife trafficking, and illegal timber trafficking, it's really gone up the political radar over the last maybe 5-10 years, and the fact that you have a number of international bodies, the forming of IQIC, the International Consortium Against Wildlife Crime, offering the means for countries who might not know where to start, right? So even if I was to identify, Nigeria, as I have done, as a hotspot for the trafficking of wildlife and timber, the Nigerian authorities might say, well, look, where do we start in terms of, our legal framework, our enforcement capacity, our, intelligence-led policing, our sharing of information across international borders. I mean, what do we start with? Something like the IQIC was formed, and they created a toolkit, the ability for a country to be assisted to undertake an assessment of all the capacities, all the things they needed to do to be able to tackle wildlife and timber crime, and then to score and identify areas where they might improve, and then attract funding. And the fact that this has gone up the political radar means that there is more funding available. So now it's just a question of using that funding effectively and appropriately. And hopefully this report identifying these hotspot areas that we have will help the international community to do that. Get more bang for our buck as we invest.
Excellent. Well, I must say it's a great piece of work, and it's actually making connections that I've worked for EIA for about a decade now, and I've not been aware of the extent to which these different crime streams crossed over. So, well done on that. But what's actually next for your Nexus work? Are you taking it anywhere else?
Yeah, no. So one of the things that the report identifies, and I've talked about shipping a fair bit in this discussion we've had. We'd like to, and we are currently engaging with several other NGOs and a consortium called the United for Wildlife Task Force. United for Wildlife was set up under the aegis of the Duke of Cambridge, who I think has a personal commitment to stopping wildlife trafficking and stopping the decimation of wildlife species, and from a conservation perspective. And EIA is a member. We signed up to something called the Buckingham Palace Declaration, and the United for Wildlife set up 2 task forces. One of them is looking at finance. So this is where the money from illegal wildlife and illegal logging, where does that money go? Which countries, through which means is it moved? Where is it invested? How is it laundered? So we are currently, as a campaign, we're engaging with the Financial Action Task Force, and the Financial Action Task Force is the principal global body in charge of setting standards and then monitoring and policing those standards against money laundering. And they're focusing at the moment on illegal logging. So we'll continue to engage on EIA's behalf as a campaign, and EIA as an organisation will continue to engage with the FATF on that. And we'll share some of the knowledge that we have derived from the investigations that we've done. And then we're also going to be working through the task force with members on their transport Task Force, United Wildlife Transport Transport Task Force. Quite a mouthful, that. And that work will focus on maritime trafficking. So we will try to work with shipping companies, with what are called freight forwarders, the guys who actually move the containers and pack the containers and get them onto the ships, and port authorities eventually, to try and toughen up that movement of goods, to make it more difficult for traffickers to get illegal timber and illegal wildlife out of the places they're moving it out of, and eventually onto market. Because if we stop that flow, or if we make it more difficult, then the logic or the incentive for traffickers to, do more wildlife trafficking or do more timber trafficking, it reduces, because their costs of doing business effectively go up.
Excellent. Well, it sounds like you've got a pretty full dance card for the next few months, man.
Yeah, should see us busy.
Super. Well, best of luck with that, and I hope it goes really well.
Thanks, Paul.
And maybe we'll come back and chat about it again when you've got some more findings to share with us.
Yeah, I'd love to do that. To do that. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk today.
Well, James, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And if you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, please watch this space for future episodes, and check out our website at eia-international.org to find out more about our work. Thank you very much for joining us, and wherever you are out there, stay safe.